The Pursuit of Happiness, Chapter 4 Summary, The Distribution of Happiness. Daniel G. Brinton. Chapter 4 of Daniel G. Brinton's The Pursuit of Happiness asks a fascinating question. Is happiness distributed equally among people, societies, genders, and different stages of life? After defining happiness in Chapter 2 and examining different kinds of pleasure in Chapter 3, Brinton now looks at who is happy, who is less happy, and why. He examines social class, civilization, men and women, and different ages of life. The chapter is titled The Distribution of Happiness and occupies roughly pages 26-35 in the original work. Project Gutenberg plus one note. Some of Brinton's observations about women, social roles, and age reflect 19th century assumptions. I'll present them as Brinton's historical arguments, rather than as established facts today. 1. The central question: who gets the most happiness? Brinton begins by asking us to examine how happiness is actually distributed. It is tempting to assume more money plus more power plus more opportunities equals more happiness. Similarly, we might assume that a more civilized society automatically produces happier individuals. But Brinton says the answer is not so simple. He wants to investigate happiness scientifically by comparing different social classes, different levels of civilization, men and women, children and adults, young people and older people. His purpose is to discover whether the means of happiness necessarily produce more actual happiness. Project Gutenberg 2. Does wealth make people happier? One of the first issues Brinton examines is the relationship between means and happiness. Common sense tells us that people with greater resources should be happier. A wealthy person can afford better food, better housing, education, travel, entertainment, healthcare, comfort, freedom from certain kinds of financial anxiety. So it seems logical that happiness should increase with wealth. But Brinton points out that some philosophers have disagreed. He mentions thinkers such as David Hume and William Paley, who argued, in different ways, that happiness may be distributed much more equally than people ordinarily assume. Project Gutenberg: the poor person may derive genuine enjoyment from simple things, while the wealthy person may remain dissatisfied. Therefore, having more means of happiness does not automatically guarantee more happiness. 3. Means of happiness are not happiness itself. This is one of the chapter's most important ideas. Imagine two people. Person A has plenty of money, a large house, expensive possessions, social status. But he is constantly anxious, dissatisfied, and competitive. Person B has modest income, simple possessions, strong relationships, meaningful work, intellectual interests, a positive attitude. Person B might experience greater happiness. Therefore, Brinton wants us to distinguish between resources that can produce happiness and actual experience of happiness. Money, education, freedom, and social position can provide opportunities, but they don't automatically convert themselves into happiness. 4. The rate of pleasure. Brinton introduces the idea of a rate of pleasure. The basic idea is that the relationship between what we possess and the pleasure we receive from it is not necessarily proportional. In other words, twice as much of something does not necessarily produce twice as much happiness. For example, suppose a person earns rupee 30,000 a month and then suddenly earns rupee 60,000. The additional money may produce a significant improvement in life. But if the same person later goes from 3 lakh to 6 lakh a month, the additional money may not produce an equally dramatic increase in happiness. Why? Because people adapt. Once something becomes normal, we may stop experiencing the same excitement from it. A luxury that once seemed extraordinary can eventually become ordinary. This means that the relationship between possessions and happiness is complicated. 5. The extremes of social class may both be unfavorable. Brinton makes an interesting observation about the two extremes of society. We might imagine that the very rich are the happiest people and the very poor are the unhappiest, but he suggests that both extremes can have disadvantages. Extreme poverty: a poor person may lack security, food, adequate housing, education, healthcare opportunities. These limitations can obviously reduce happiness. Extreme wealth: a very wealthy person may experience boredom, excessive desires, fear of losing possessions, social competition, artificial pleasures, lack of meaningful activity. Therefore, Neither extreme necessarily represents the ideal condition. Brinton's argument points toward a balanced condition in which people have sufficient resources while also developing their mental and emotional capacities. 6. Civilization does not automatically make individuals happier. This is one of the chapter's most surprising arguments. We usually assume primitive society right arrow suffering, civilized society right arrow happiness. Brinton challenges this simple equation. He discusses the view associated with Rousseau, who idealized aspects of simpler or less civilized life. He also refers to anthropological observations, suggesting that civilization does not necessarily increase the total amount of personal enjoyment. Project Gutenberg, this doesn't mean Brinton believes civilization is worthless. Rather, he distinguishes between social progress, reduction of cruelty, oppression, and injustice, and personal happiness, how happy individual people actually feel. These two things can move in different directions. 7. Civilization has eliminated many terrible social evils. Brinton is careful not to romanticize the past completely. He points out that history contains enormous amounts of suffering. He mentions practices such as the Inquisition, slavery, torture in legal proceedings, forced military service, arbitrary rule by kings and religious authorities. Many of these abuses had declined or disappeared in the societies he regarded as more advanced. So civilization has produced real improvements in human freedom and security. Project Gutenberg, but Brinton's question remains, why hasn't the increase in social progress necessarily produced a proportional increase in personal happiness? 8. Modern society creates new forms of suffering. Brinton gives several reasons. According to him, modern civilization has increased sensitivity. People may become more sensitive to discomfort, disappointment, and social comparison. Desire. Civilization creates more things to want. Competition. Greater freedom and economic competition can create pressure to outperform others. Instability. Rapid social change can produce uncertainty. This creates a paradox. Society may become objectively better while individuals become subjectively more dissatisfied. That is one of the chapter's most important insights. 9. More desires can mean more opportunities for disappointment. Imagine someone whose expectations are very limited. He wants food, shelter, safety, companionship. If he obtains these things, he may feel satisfied. Now imagine someone who has hundreds of desires: a bigger house, a better car, a higher salary, more recognition, more followers, better clothes, more status, more luxury, more achievements. Even if this person obtains many of them, new desires keep appearing. Brinton's argument is that the multiplication of desires can reduce happiness if our ability to satisfy them does not grow at the same rate. This is particularly relevant to modern consumer culture. 10. The real goal of civilization. Brinton therefore asks, what should civilization ultimately aim for? He argues that civilization should not merely focus on property plus consumption plus material comfort. Instead, a higher civilization should educate people toward forms of happiness based on intellectual development, culture, understanding, emotional richness, personal development. In other words, lower ideal acquire more things, higher ideal develop a richer human being. Brinton believes the second is a better foundation for lasting happiness. René van Marseveen. 11. The position of women in Brinton's analysis. The next major section examines happiness among men and women. Brinton argues that, in the society of his time, women generally had less happiness than men. However, he does not attribute this entirely to biology. He identifies two broad categories of causes. 1. Physical factors. He believed that women's physical constitution could influence their experience of life too. Social restrictions. More importantly, he discusses restrictions imposed by society. These included limitations relating to education, legal rights, social expectations, religious rules, independence, opportunities for development. The second category is especially important because Brinton argues that society itself can prevent people from developing their capacities for happiness. Project Gutenberg. 12. Brinton criticizes restrictions imposed on women. Brinton's argument was relatively progressive in one important respect for his era. He does not simply say, women are less happy because they are women. Instead, he asks how society has treated them. He criticizes legal and ecclesiastical restrictions that limited women's freedom and education. Project Gutenberg, his underlying principle is, if a person has undeveloped abilities, society should not unnecessarily prevent those abilities from developing. Education, therefore, becomes extremely important. 13. Education and women's happiness. Brinton distinguishes between true education and merely conventional education. Education should not simply train women, or anyone, to conform to narrow social expectations. Instead, education should expand the mind, develop judgment, cultivate independence, create intellectual interests, increase the number of possible sources of enjoyment. If women are denied these opportunities, Brinton believes their potential happiness is also restricted. This argument leads to a broader principle. Education is not merely preparation for employment, it is preparation for a richer life. 14. Society benefits when women become happier. Brinton does not present women's improvement as something that benefits women alone. He argues that men and society also gain from the intellectual and personal development of women. If half of humanity is restricted from developing its abilities, society loses enormous potential. A more educated and independent woman can contribute ideas, culture, relationships, education, social improvement. Thus, improving women's opportunities improves society itself. This is one of the more forward-looking aspects of the chapter 15. Childhood and youth are not necessarily the happiest years. The next question Brinton examines is age. Many people believe childhood is the happiest time of life. Often remember childhood nostalgically, but Brinton challenges this idea. He suggests that adults may romanticize childhood because memory tends to soften or forget earlier difficulties. Children may experience fear, dependence, frustration, ignorance, lack of freedom, inability to control their circumstances. Therefore, childhood is not automatically the happiest period. 16. Why do adults remember childhood so fondly? Brinton suggests that memory plays a major role. When adults look back, they may remember games, holidays, friends, freedom from adult responsibilities, but they may forget punishments, fears, confusion, dependence, emotional problems. This produces an idealized picture of childhood, so the statement, "Those were the best days of my life," may sometimes be more about memory than objective happiness. 17. Youth is not necessarily the peak of happiness either. Brinton extends the argument to youth. Young people often have strong physical energy, curiosity, excitement, ambition. But they may also have uncertainty, emotional instability, limited experience, financial dependence, unfulfilled desires, lack of control over their lives. Therefore, youth has pleasures, but also significant difficulties. Brinton rejects the assumption that happiness automatically declines after youth. 18. Happiness should increase with development. Brinton proposes a very different ideal. He argues that, under favorable conditions, enjoyment should increase as mental and physical powers develop. He places the period of fullest development around middle adulthood, approximately the mid-40s to around 50, according to his 19th century observations. Project Gutenberg, the underlying principle is more important than the exact age. Maturity can bring greater happiness because mature people have greater developed capacities. A mature person may possess more knowledge, greater emotional control, greater self-awareness, more financial independence, deeper relationships, richer interests, greater understanding of life. Therefore, getting older does not automatically mean becoming less happy. 19. Physical and mental strength matter. Brinton connects happiness with mental and physical vigor. As people develop their abilities, they gain more ways to experience life. A person who has developed intellectual interests can enjoy books and ideas. Someone with strong social abilities can enjoy friendships. Someone with artistic sensitivity can enjoy music and art. Someone with physical vitality can enjoy movement and nature. Therefore, development increases the number and quality of possible experiences. This connects directly with Chapter 3's argument that happiness involves expansion and growth. 20. But Brinton does recognize aging. Brinton does not claim that aging has no disadvantages. After physical maturity, he argues, physical decline eventually begins. This can reduce certain forms of enjoyment. For example, physical energy may decline, health problems may appear, sensory abilities may weaken, mobility may decrease. But Brinton does not believe this means happiness must disappear. Instead, he suggests that continued effort and mental development can partly compensate for physical decline. 21. Old age is not automatically wisdom. Another traditional belief Brinton challenges is older people are automatically wiser. Provides experience, but experience alone does not guarantee wisdom. A person can grow older without becoming more knowledgeable, more thoughtful, more open-minded, more capable of understanding others. Therefore, age not equal to wisdom. Wisdom requires development. This fits Brinton's overall philosophy that happiness depends on what happens to the individual through growth and activity, not simply the passage of time. 22. The problem of artificial pleasures in old age. Brinton also discusses what he considers spurious or artificial enjoyments of old age. His concern is that older people may sometimes try to reproduce the pleasures of youth without possessing the same physical capacities. Instead of developing new sources of enjoyment appropriate to their stage of life, they may cling to old habits. Brinton's broader lesson is, every stage of life should develop its own appropriate sources of happiness. You don't have to remain psychologically stuck in the past. 23. The larger principle, happiness changes with life. The chapter therefore presents happiness as something dynamic. It changes as people change, childhood limited abilities and dependence. Youth increasing energy and possibilities, but also uncertainty. Maturity greater physical and intellectual development. Later life possible physical decline, but opportunities for deeper knowledge and reflection. Thus, there is no single age that automatically guarantees happiness. 24. What Brinton is really saying about society. The chapter can be understood as a criticism of a simplistic formula. More civilization equals more happiness. Brinton's argument is more complicated. Civilization can remove suffering and increase freedom. But civilization can also increase desires, competition, sensitivity, and dissatisfaction. Therefore, the quality of civilization matters more than material advancement alone. A society should not measure its success merely by wealth, production, property, technology, consumption. It should ask, are human beings actually becoming better equipped to live rich, meaningful, and satisfying lives? 25. The importance of education. Education emerges as one of Brinton's major solutions. If people are educated only to earn money, they may become economically productive without becoming happier. A broader education should help people understand themselves, their bodies, their minds, society, relationships, knowledge, different sources of enjoyment. This idea becomes the central subject of the next chapter, Chapter 5, where Brinton presents principles for a self-education aimed at increasing happiness. Project Gutenberg. 26. Happiness cannot be measured by possessions alone. The chapter ultimately asks us to rethink what we mean by progress. Suppose a society becomes richer. People own more possessions, technology improves, transportation becomes faster, communication becomes easier. But people also become more anxious, more competitive, more dissatisfied, more dependent on status, more overwhelmed by desires. Can we simply say that the society is happier? Brinton's answer is no. Material progress is valuable, but it must be accompanied by development of the human being. 27. The modern relevance of Brinton's argument. Although written in 1893, this part of Brinton's argument feels surprisingly modern. Consider social media. People today can see thousands of examples of other people's houses, cars, holidays, careers, bodies, relationships, achievements. This creates an enormous number of desires and comparisons. A person who would once have been satisfied with a modest life may now feel inadequate because they constantly compare themselves with others. Brinton's basic idea that increased desires can increase dissatisfaction can therefore be applied to modern consumer and social media culture. 28. The paradox of progress. The chapter can be summarized through a paradox. Progress gives us more freedom, knowledge, possessions, choices, opportunities. But it can also give us more desires, competition, expectations, comparisons, anxiety. Therefore, more possibilities do not automatically mean more happiness. We must learn how to use those possibilities intelligently. 29. Brinton's ideal civilization. Brinton ultimately imagines a higher form of civilization. Its purpose would not simply be to help people own more. Its purpose would be to help people become more. Instead of asking, how much property does a person possess? We should ask, how rich is the person's intellectual, emotional, and spiritual life? This is a fundamental shift from material civilization to human development. René van Marseveen 30. Main lessons from Chapter 41. Wealth is not the same as happiness. Money can provide means for happiness, but it cannot guarantee happiness too. More desires can create more dissatisfaction. If desires grow faster than our ability to satisfy them, happiness can decline. 3. Civilization has two sides. It can eliminate terrible forms of suffering while simultaneously creating new psychological pressures. 4. Freedom matters. A society that gives individuals greater control over their lives can create better conditions for happiness. 5. Education is essential. People need education, not only for earning money, but also for learning how to live. 6. Social restrictions can reduce happiness. Brinton particularly applies this argument to the restrictions placed on women in his era. 7. Childhood is not automatically the happiest time. Adults may idealize childhood because memory forgets many early difficulties. 8. Happiness can grow with maturity. Greater knowledge, experience, and developed abilities can create richer forms of happiness. 9. Aging. Ray